The rain poured heavily, drumming against the rusted zinc roof of a small mud house at the edge of Umuike village. The wind howled through the trees, making the wooden door creak. Inside, a young woman lay on a raffia mat, her body weak and trembling. Her belly was swollen with child, and pain twisted her face. Her name was Nkem. She was only 19, but life had already been cruel to her. Nkem was born into poverty. Her father, a palm wine tapper, died when she was 5 years old. He had fallen from the top of an iroko tree while at work. The villagers said it was bad luck, but her mother, Adorgo, knew it was hunger. He had climbed that tree with an empty stomach, and his body had failed him. After his death, Adorgo struggled to feed her 5 children. She sold vegetables in the village market, but the money was never enough. Some nights, they went to bed hungry. Other nights, they soaked gari in water and pretended it was a feast. Despite their suffering, Nkem grew up with a kind heart. She was always smiling, always helping. People in the village called her Nkem Oma, Good Nkem. She fetched water for the old women, carried heavy loads for the market traders, and cared for her younger siblings. Then, love came. Obinna was the village youth leader. He was tall, strong, and full of sweet words. He told Nkem she was the most beautiful girl in the world. He promised her marriage, a bright future, a happy life. She believed him. One evening, under the big mango tree near the village square, he kissed her for the first time. The stars were bright, and the air smelled of ripe fruit. He held her hand and whispered, "I will never leave you." But he did. When Nkem told him she was pregnant, everything changed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Obinna said. "This child is not mine." She stared at him, her heart breaking. He turned away and left. When the village elders called him to speak, he stood before them and said, "She has been with many men. I cannot claim what is not mine." Whispers spread like wildfire. The women shook their heads in disappointment. The men muttered among themselves. Children pointed at her and laughed. Shame covered Nkem like a thick cloth. Her mother wept. "Why did you bring disgrace upon this family?" she cried. "How can I face the village now?" Nkem had no answer. Life became unbearable. The women in the market stopped talking to her. The girls she once called friends avoided her. Her younger siblings looked at her with confusion, not understanding why their sister was now treated like an outcast. One evening, her mother called her inside. "You cannot stay here," she said. Nkem's heart sank. "Mama, please," she begged. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "I love you, my daughter. But I have other children to care for. If you stay, we will all suffer." And so, Nkem left the house. She walked for hours in the rain, carrying only a small bundle of clothes. She found shelter in an old, abandoned hut at the edge of the village. It was broken, the roof leaking, the walls weak. But it was the only place she had. An old widow, Mama Efima, lived nearby. She took pity on Nkem and brought her food when she could. But she, too, was poor. The months passed. Nkem's belly grew heavy, and her body became weak. She no longer had the strength to walk far. The hunger, the shame, and the loneliness drained her. Then, one stormy night, the pains began. She screamed in agony, clutching her stomach. There was no one to help her. The rain poured, the wind howled, and she lay alone on the cold floor. After hours of pain, a tiny cry filled the air. Her baby had arrived. A boy. Small, fragile, but alive. Nkem held him close, tears streaming down her face. She touched his soft cheek and whispered, "Chizoba." It meant God protect us. but it seemed God was silent. That night, the fever started. Her body burned with heat. Her breaths became weak. She had no medicine, no food, no one to take care of her. Mema Ifema came the next morning and saw Nkem shivering. She placed a damp cloth on her forehead and prayed. But prayers were not enough. By the third night, Nkem knew she was dying. She cradled her son, rocking him gently. Her lips moved, whispering a lullaby her mother once sang to her. Her voice faded. Her eyes closed. And she was gone. The next morning, Mema Ifema found her lifeless body. Chizoba lay beside her, crying weakly. The old woman wrapped him in a cloth and carried him to the village square. The elders gathered, staring at the orphaned child. "What shall we do with him?" one of them asked. There was silence. Obinna was called. He stood before the people, his face blank. "I have no son," he said. And he walked away. In the end, Mema Ifema took Chizoba in. She fed him what little she had and told him stories about his mother. Years passed. Chizoba grew into a quiet, hard-working boy. But the village never let him forget where he came from. They called him Nkem's bastard. Yet, he never fought back. He studied hard, learning under the village teacher. He walked miles to school with an empty stomach but never gave up. One day, he left for the city. Years later, he returned not as the poor orphan they once mocked, but as a doctor. The same village that had cast his mother out now lined up at his doorstep, seeking his help. And Chizoba, with his mother's kind heart, healed them. But every evening, he would walk to the abandoned hut where his mother had died. He would sit there in silence, tearfully staring at the place where she had breathed her last. And in the wind, he would hear her voice. Soft, melodious but sorrowful, most times faint. Singing the lullaby she had once whispered to him. During such moments, he would weep and miss his mother more than ever before. Here are 3 moral lessons from this video. 1. Compassion and generosity matter. The old widow's kindness in buying gifts for the young boy shows that acts of love and generosity, no matter how small, can make a big difference in someone's life. 2. The value of sacrifice. The widow, despite her own struggles, chooses to care for the child, teaching that true love often requires selflessness and sacrifice. 3. Kindness leaves a lasting impact. Helping others, especially the vulnerable, creates a cycle of goodness that can inspire future generations to be compassionate and caring. Thanks for watching. Please like, share and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Love you all.